Okay, so let's talk about biomes. Biomes are a region of the world, and when we talk about a region, this is on a larger scale than some ecosystems, so it's a very wide scale ecological community, and a biome is characterized by specific types of soils and plants and animals and microflora, all that live in areas that have a similar climate. There are 7 different terrestrial biomes, and we will go through each one in this lecture, and they're named after the resident vegetation, so they're named after whatever is the dominant vegetation that lives in that area. And it's important to note that the boundaries for these terrestrial biomes are a little bit fuzzy, so you can be driving along and you can be in one biome, and then you can kind of slowly go into another biome, and then you're in that transition region between them for part of the time. If you'd like to learn more about biomes, please visit the NASA Earth Observatory website. And it looks like it's cut off here, so I will make sure that it's put into your page correctly. Biomes, different organisms can survive in different climates, and that's referred to as the range of tolerance for an organism. So if you live in a desert, you'll know that cactus, they don't survive well with freezing temperatures. And so that's the range of tolerance for a cactus. This tends to be warmer temperatures, above freezing, and low rainfall, whereas tropical plants, they wouldn't do well in the desert, and so they need high levels of rainfall, moderate temperatures, but many tropical plants also need it to be above freezing. So that's the range of tolerance, and you can see that that depends predominantly on precipitation levels and temperatures. The climate of an area is a description of the average weather of a region, and in order to define climate, you need to have at least about 30 years of weather information. And that's the rule of thumb. We typically say is 30 years of weather information will tell you the climate. So if you know the average weather in June for a region over a 30-year period, then that gives you an idea of what the climate is for that region. Many of you have probably seen this before. These are the Köppen climate zones, and so these tend to dictate where the different biomes are on Earth, because the biomes are very closely tied to climate zones. And so again, this shows you that the areas of high rainfall tend to be around the middle latitudes, and then as you move further out, we have lower rainfall, and then also as we move further away from the equator, we tend to have cold winters, which can also influence what plants can survive in a region. As we mentioned, there's 7 terrestrial biomes, and we'll go through each one. These include coniferous forests, temperate deciduous forest, rainforest, so there's 3 kinds of forests, biomes, grassland or prairie, so you can call it either one, grassland or prairie. Those are interchangeable terms. Shrublands, desert, and then tundra. And I grew up in Alaska, and so this is one of my favorite animals, the muskox, which live in one of the harshest biomes, the tundra. And they have this beautiful thick fur that keeps them warm in the winter. Okay, so coniferous forests are forests that are made up predominantly of conifer trees. Often you'll hear of those referred to as evergreen trees because they, for the most part, keep needles all year. And so these trees, they have needles instead of leaves, and then they have cones instead of flowers, and that's how they spread their seed. Coniferous forests, the trees in these forests are adapted to very cold or very dry conditions. The needles help them to not lose too much moisture. And some example trees from this type of forest would be spruce trees, fir, or pine trees. There's actually 2 different types of coniferous forests on Earth. There's the northern boreal forest. So Canada has this huge area of boreal forest, and that area uh, is between about 50 and 60 degrees north latitude. And then of course there's other regions around Earth at that latitude that also has a northern boreal forest. The temperatures range widely, but they're generally on the cooler side. So these are degrees in Fahrenheit, from minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter to highs in the 70s. So they don't get super warm. They also don't get a lot of precipitation, so they're not a rainforest. They get between 12 and 35 inches of precipitation a year. But because they are at a higher latitude and the temperatures are lower, you don't see very high evaporation rates, and so that's why they still look fairly lush and green. There's also coniferous forests at temperate areas that have high elevations. So North America, Asia, and Europe all have some areas with high elevation, so mountain regions. And although if you were down lower on the mountains, it would be fairly warm year-round. If you go up higher on the mountains, those regions do stay cooler, and so they are still the coniferous forests. These do tend to have slightly warmer temperatures than the northern boreal forests, and they get more rain because they're up higher in elevation, so they get some rain shadow effect when the clouds meet up with the higher elevations in the mountains. So these do get up to 80 inches of precipitation per year. There's some really lovely furry critters that live in coniferous forests, and so here's a picture of some of them. We have black bears. Many different types of bears actually can live in coniferous forests. Bald eagles, gray wolf, red squirrel, and snowshoe hare are all shown in this slide. Another type of forest that was listed in our list of biomes was the temperate deciduous forest. So in this forest you see leaf-bearing trees, and with leaf-bearing trees they change with seasons. So these are the types of trees that lose their leaves in the fall or winter, and then they come back on in the spring. This helps them to survive the colder winters. These don't get quite as cold as the northern boreal forest that we just discussed for the coniferous trees, but they do get warmer, and so there's this is actually similarly wide range of temperatures that they experience. These include broadleaf trees like oaks, maples, and beeches, and also shrubs that live in these forests, herbs and mosses. You can see ferns growing here. They get about the same amount of precipitation as the northern boreal forest at 30 to 60 inches per year. And you can find these forests in the eastern United States, China, Japan, Europe, and Canada. They're pretty widespread, and they reside at kind of those middle latitudes. Some of the critters that live in deciduous forests include deer, squirrels, raccoons, great horned owl, and other types of owls, and woodpeckers. Rainforests, you probably hear a lot about rainforests, and they're especially important when we talk about biodiversity. Rainforests are wonderful places to visit because you get to experience very tall and dense vegetation, and lots of animals can hide in that vegetation, and so it's a wonderful source for biodiversity. There's many different plant animal species, and also we should mention insect and microbial species that live in these rainforest regions. Some of you may not realize there's two types of rainforests on Earth. There's tropical rainforests, which is what you usually think of when you think of a rainforest, but there's also temperate rainforests. And so if you've been to Alaska or parts of Canada along the coast, you may have experienced a temperate rainforest. It still gets a ton of rain, but it's just a cooler environment, and it's at a higher latitude. But we'll focus on tropical rainforests because that's important for biodiversity, and it is the majority of rainforests. but it's important to note that the temperate rainforests do have conifer trees also instead of deciduous trees. So tropical rainforests, they don't experience a very wide range of temperatures. We're talking about 65 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. It might be a little wider as we experience climate change, but it's still not the range that we're thinking about with some of these other forests. They do not receive frost, and they are rainy all the time, so year-round pretty much. There are drier seasons and wetter seasons, but overall they're fairly rainy all the time. Tropical rainforests can receive anywhere from 80 to 400 inches of precipitation per year, and the trees grow very, very tall, up to 250 feet. You'll also see, if you're in a rainforest, there's many levels to the rainforest. So there's the tall upper canopy, then down below that there's vines and palm trees in the middle, and then at the very bottom you'll see lots of ferns and orchids that enjoy that kind of darker understory area where the light doesn't penetrate as much, but they're still very warm and moist. And then at the very bottom, if you're talking about the bottom part of the canopy in the soil, there's a lot of microbes and so fungi and bacteria that can biodegrade plants as they die and decay. There are tons of animals that live in the rainforest, and this is a sampling of a few of them. So jaguar, very good at hiding in the rainforest. These spots help them to hide in all the, the dappled light that gets through. It kind of looks like they have shadows and dappled light on their body. It helps them to hide. Toucan, lovely birds that don't hide sometimes as well, but I think they're mimicking kind of tropical flowers that grow in the rainforest to help them hide a little bit. Spider monkeys, and then there's all kinds of beautiful frogs and snakes that live in tropical rainforests. Grasslands and prairies are the next ecosystem, so we're going to move out of forests and into kind of lower rainfall regions. Prairies are open and flat regions that have a lot of grass growing in them. They tend to lie between deserts and temperate forests. And so when you're looking at a map, they're between that subtropical latitude that deserts are in and the higher latitudes of temperate forests. Grasses, because it does get cold still in the prairie land or in grasslands, they do die back in the winter to their roots, and then in the spring they come back up. The temperature ranges from 0 degrees, so below freezing, up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and that depends on the latitude of the grassland. They don't get a lot of precipitation, and that's why you don't have trees growing here, because the grasses can survive with this lower precipitation. They get between 20 and 35 inches per year. The more rain that they get, the taller the grasses grow. There's a number of different animals that are adapted to grasslands and prairies. In the United States, buffalo are classic grassland animals. Meerkats and prairie dogs, these are similar animals that burrow in the ground and come out and they have to have someone that watches for predators since they don't have trees to hide in. Prairie chickens, I just think this is an awesome picture. Prairie chickens, zebras, if you're talking about African prairies or grasslands, then you see zebras and giraffes, those kind of animals. Shrublands are another area that are kind of an intermediate area between grasslands and desert, maybe. So if you think of a shrubland, that's an area where you have lots of little scrubby shrubs. They have very hot and dry summers and then cooler and moister winters. Because they have very hot, dry summers, you can get frequent fires during the dry season. When lightning and storms come through, it can spark fires. And some of the plants that grow in these shrublands include well, obviously shrubs, grasses, acacia, sage, rosemary. So all of these plants, because they live in places with very hot and dry summers, they're going to have small needle-like leaves, and some of them have waxes on the leaves, and that protects them from too much evaporation, loss of water. They don't want to lose too much water to the atmosphere through their leaves. Shrublands tend to lie between the 30 and 40 degree latitude, and they're on the western coasts. So some examples of shrublands, you can find them in California, you can find them in Arizona too, Chile, Africa, Australia, and along the Mediterranean Sea. And I don't know if I mentioned the precipitation, 8 to 40 inches per year. So when you're talking about 8 inches of precipitation a year, that's very similar to desert and tundra levels of precipitation. Some of the animals we find in shrublands include elephants and zebras. So like I said, these tend to lie next to grasslands and prairies, so you have some of the same animals. Here's some more African savanna animals. Jackrabbits, so we see those in the desert southwest, and hawks. Deserts. So Arizona State University is located in one of the large deserts of the United States, which is the Sonoran Desert. Other example deserts would be the Mojave Desert in California, the Chihuahua Desert in Mexico, and Great Basin Desert. Darn, I'm blanking on where that is. There's the Sahara Desert in Africa, the Negev Desert in the Middle East, and the Gobi Desert in Asia. So those are the big deserts around the world. Deserts, as you know, are hot and dry. There are some Arctic or Antarctic, what we call deserts, where they receive very low rainfall. But generally, when we talk about deserts, we're talking about hot and dry deserts. They experience, because there's no humidity in the air, they experience drastic temperature differences from day to night. It can be 35 degrees Fahrenheit different from day to night. And they tend to lie in the subtropical latitudes of 15 to 35 degrees north and south of the equator. Temperatures in the desert, they can range from, this should say Fahrenheit, 25 degrees Fahrenheit, so they can get below freezing for short periods of time, and then they can get into temperatures well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Deserts receive about 10 inches of precipitation per year or less. Here's some pictures of desert animals, and you'll notice that these desert animals are adapted to the hot, dry conditions. And so, for example, the thorny devil lizard, it can collect water down its tail into its mouth. The tortoise is very good at burrowing in the ground to protect itself from the hot daytime temperatures, and it has this lovely shell to protect itself from predators, but also its scaly skin keeps it from losing too much water due to evaporation. Some of these other animals, this is another burrowing animal, the kangaroo rat, and then javelina are just very interesting animals. They are nocturnal, so they only are out at night, and during the day they hide in washes in the shade, and they can eat prickly pear cactus, even though those cactus have very long spines on them. They're able to crunch them up and eat them to get water. Okay, our last biome is tundra. Tundra comes from the Finnish word tunturia, which means a treeless plain. And you can see in this picture that tundra is indeed treeless. So the plants that live in the tundra, they have to have very shallow roots, because the tundra is frozen much of the year, and even the areas that are not frozen much of the year, if you get down into the soil more than a couple inches, then you hit permafrost, which is soil that doesn't thaw year-round. So the roots of the plants have to be very shallow, and they also have to be plants that can grow very quickly once the temperatures do get above freezing. So these plants include lichens, mosses, grasses, sedges, and shrubs, very small shrubs. Uh, Tundra experiences freezing temperatures for more than half of the year, 6 to 10 months per year, and the temperatures range from minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit or even colder up to about 65 degrees Fahrenheit. With global climate change, we are seeing that the tundra is warming up. Some of the permafrost is beginning to thaw, and temperatures are getting higher than 65 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer. And so that is presenting a number of challenges for animals and people that live in this region. The tundra receives very little precipitation per year, 6 to 10 inches of, if you thawed out the snow, it would be 6 to 10 inches of water. But of course most of it falls as snow, and so it's thicker than 6 to 10 inches of snow that you have on the ground sometimes. And we find tundra in the Arctic areas of North America, Europe, and Siberia. Here's some pictures of tundra animals. So the muskox that we saw earlier, a snowshoe hare, that's an Arctic hare, polar bears, which are kind of the poster child right now, what we're seeing when we talk about climate change in the Arctic. A lot of times we're talking about polar bears and their survival issues that they have from melting sea ice. Harp seals and other types of seals live in the Arctic. And caribou, so these are migrating animals that travel from the tundra south in the winter, so they actually don't live in the tundra year-round, but they do summer in the tundra. Okay, so that concludes all of our 7 terrestrial biomes.